There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over the Australian outback in the late afternoon. It's not a peaceful quiet, not really. It's a heavy, sun-bleached silence, thick with the buzz of flies and the distant, lonely cry of a gullah. It's a silence that presses down on you, forcing you to listen to the thoughts you've spent a lifetime running from. I was sitting on the veranda of our old farmhouse, wrapped in that very silence, when the man from town handed me the envelope. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. The crisp, official weight of it, the way my name was typed so impersonally, Helen Anderson, it was a verdict delivered before the trial had even begun. My husband, the man I'd shared a life with for 32 years, the man whose sun-weathered skin I knew better than my own, had filed for divorce. And the reason, typed in cold, black ink, was a wound that stole the very breath from my lungs. Irreconcilable differences, citing negligent motherhood. Negligent. The word echoed in the hollowed-out space that was now my chest. It wasn't just an accusation. It was an erasure. It wiped away 3 decades of early mornings packing lunchboxes, of sitting through endless school concerts, of holding back hair during teenage stomach bugs. It mocked the worry lines etched around my eyes, each one a story of a late-night wait for a daughter's car to pull into the drive. It made a mockery of the very essence of who I was, who I had tried so desperately to be. His name is Robert. Robert, who used to whisper that I was his anchor, the steady hand that kept our little ship from capsizing in the rough seas of drought and debt, and the sheer, back-breaking work of keeping a Queensland cattle property afloat. We were a team. Or so I thought. He managed the herd, the fences, the grueling physical labor under the relentless sun. And I managed everything else. The books, the house, the garden that provided our vegetables, the endless cooking for stockmen, and our daughter. Our beautiful, fiery, complicated daughter, Claire. The papers claimed I was emotionally distant. That I was more concerned with the balance sheets and the rotting weatherboards of the old house than I was with the emotional landscape of my own family. Robert, in his affidavit, painted a picture of a woman cold and calculating, a woman who saw a child as another item on a to-do list. He said Claire often felt like an afterthought. Reading those words, crafted by a lawyer he'd driven to in the city, a place I rarely visited, felt like being flayed alive. Every sacrifice, every silent worry, every time I'd gone without so they could have, was twisted into something ugly and selfish. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive into town, find his new flat above the hardware store, and shake him until his teeth rattled. How could he? How could he use the one thing he knew would destroy me? He wasn't just leaving me, he was trying to dismantle my entire history, to prove that my life's work as a mother was a failure. The loneliness that followed that initial burst of rage was more profound than any the outback could ever conjure. It was a vast, empty plain inside me, where the only sound was the wind of my own regret. The weeks leading to the court date were a blur of stark, sunlit agony. Our lawyer, a kind but harried woman from Brisbane, tried to prepare me. "It's going to be tough, Helen," she'd said, her voice gentle over the crackling phone line. "They're going to portray you as, well, as preoccupied. They'll say the farm was your first child." "The farm was our life," I'd whispered, the receiver slick in my hand. "It was our future. It was Claire's inheritance." "I know, but the court doesn't always see it that way. They see a father seeking a closer relationship with his adult daughter and a mother who stood in the way." I felt the walls of the old house closing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards was a memory. There, in the kitchen, was where Claire had scraped her knee running in from the yard, and I'd held her, my shirt stained with her tears and the red dust of our land. There, on that faded rug, was where we'd built elaborate Lego castles, the pieces now probably buried in a box in the shed. He was there for those moments too, but he was always just back from the paddocks, smelling of sweat and leather and dry grass. He was the fun parent, the weekend event. I was the constant, the mundane. The one who said, "Have you done your homework?" and "It's time for bed." I was the wall she pushed against, and he was the open field she ran towards. Now he was telling the world that my constancy was negligence, that my worry was coldness. The injustice of it was a physical pain, a constant ache behind my breastbone. The morning of the hearing, I put on the only suit I owned, a navy blue one I'd bought for my father's funeral a decade ago. It hung looser on me now. Grief and stress had whittled me away. I drove the long, straight road to the city, the red earth giving way to scraggly bush, then finally to suburbs. The courthouse was a monument of cold, gray stone, so different from the warm, weathered timber of my home. Inside, the air was chilled and smelled of floor polish and despair. I saw Robert across the room. He looked older, thinner. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was sitting next to his lawyer, a young man in an expensive suit who kept checking his phone. And then I saw Claire. My heart leapt, a desperate, traitorous thing. She was 28 now, a woman, beautiful and poised in a simple black dress. She looked so much like my mother it stole my breath. She sat on her father's side of the aisle. She didn't look at me either. The proceedings began. It was a numbingly formal dance of legal phrases and objections. Robert's lawyer stood up and began to speak. He talked about a marriage that had grown distant, about a wife who was more married to the land than to her husband. He spoke of a child who felt unseen and unprioritized. He used my own actions against me. The time I'd missed a school play because I was tending to a calving heifer, the years I'd spent hunched over the farm accounts at the kitchen table late into the night instead of watching television with the family. Each example was a tiny, precise cut. He made my dedication look like indifference. He made my labor look like a choice to exclude them. I felt the judge's eyes on me, and I tried to sit straighter, to look less like the cold, negligent woman they were describing and more like the heartbroken, terrified one I was. Then it was our lawyer's turn. She did her best, speaking of my unwavering commitment to the family unit, of the financial stability the farm provided, of the partnership Robert and I had shared. But the words sounded defensive, then against the sharp, emotional narrative the other side had woven. And then, the judge, a woman with a stern face and tired eyes, spoke. Given the nature of the allegations concerning the parental relationship, I think it would be pertinent to hear from the daughter in question. Miss Claire Anderson, would you please take the stand? My blood ran cold. This was it. The moment I had been dreading more than any other. Claire stood up, her posture perfect, and walked to the witness stand. She was sworn in, her voice clear and steady. She looked at her father's lawyer, then at ours. And then, for the first time that day, her eyes met mine. There was no anger in them, no resentment, just a profound, bottomless sadness that seemed to reach across the wood-paneled room and wrap its fingers around my throat. The lawyer for my husband began his questions. Ms. Anderson, he started, his voice using a false sympathy. Can you describe for the court your relationship with your mother, Helen, during your childhood? Claire took a slow breath. Her gaze never left mine. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, but it carried in the dead silence of the courtroom. My mother, she began, and I braced myself for the blow, was always there. The lawyer smiled slightly, thinking she was agreeing with him. Can you elaborate? Was she physically present, but emotionally absent? Claire shook her head slowly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. No, that's not it at all. She paused, gathering herself, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing of the stand. You asked me to describe my relationship with her. But to do that, I have to ask her a question. A question I've been carrying with me for 20 years. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with mine, and the entire world shrunk down to that single, searing point of connection. Mum, she whispered, her voice breaking. Do you remember the yellow dress? The air in the courtroom vanished. The stern-faced judge, the smug lawyer, the tense figure of Robert, they all dissolved into a blur. There was only Claire's face, pale and streaked with tears, and those 3 words, hanging between us like a ghost. The yellow dress. A memory, long buried under the weight of years and worry, erupted in my mind with the force of a physical blow. It was so vivid, so bright, it hurt to look at. Claire was 7. It was the year of the great drought. The land wasn't just dry, it was cracked and bleeding dust. The sky was a relentless, brassy blue, and the sun was a merciless eye. Our savings were bleeding out just like the land, paying for feed for cattle that were still too thin, for diesel for the generator when the power was cut. The tension in the house was a third presence, sitting at the kitchen table with us, sucking the joy out of every meal. The school social was coming up. It was the biggest event of the year for the kids in our isolated district, a chance to forget the struggling farms and dance in the dusty hall. For weeks, all Claire could talk about was a dress she had seen in a catalog. It was yellow. Not just any yellow. It was the color of a canary, of a fresh daffodil, a shocking, brilliant slash of joy in our gray-brown world. She'd torn the page out and pinned it to the wall above her bed. "Can I get it, Mum?" "Please," she'd ask every night, her small hands clasped together as if in prayer. The price was exorbitant. It was a week's worth of fuel, a month's worth of groceries. It was an impossible, frivolous dream. And I, the pragmatic one, the keeper of the dwindling accounts, had to be the one to shatter it. "Oh, darling, not this year," I'd said, my voice tight with the strain of holding our world together. "We have to be careful. Maybe we can find something just as nice at the op shop in town." The light in her eyes didn't just dim. It was extinguished. She didn't throw a tantrum. That would have been easier. She just nodded, a small, stoic acceptance that was far too old for her 7 years, and walked away. The catalog page stayed on her wall, a daily reminder of my failure to provide this one simple piece of happiness. The day of the social arrived. I had found a dress for her at the charity shop, a serviceable, pale blue thing with a small, frayed bow at the collar. It was clean and neat, but it was not yellow. It was not brilliant. As I helped her into it, she stood perfectly still, her little body rigid. She didn't complain. She just looked at her reflection in the mirror with a hollow resignation that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. Robert saw it too. He scooped her up. "You look beautiful, my little champion," he'd said, his voice booming with a false cheer that grated on my nerves. He was the good cop, the comforter. I was the villain, the bringer of bad news. We drove to the hall. The memory of that night is a smear of noise and dust for me. I was preoccupied, talking to other farmers' wives about rainfall that wasn't coming, about bank managers and interest rates. I saw Claire standing by the punch bowl, not dancing, the sad blue dress looking even sadder under the harsh fluorescent lights. I saw Robert swing her around the dance floor once, making her laugh, but the moment his arms let her go, the solitude settled back over her like a shroud. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and acute, but I buried it. There were practicalities to discuss. Survival was more important than a yellow dress. Or so I told myself. Now, in the cold silence of the courtroom, Claire was asking me about it. Her voice was stronger now, laced with the raw emotion of that 7-year-old girl. "Do you remember, Mum?" she repeated. I wore the blue dress. The one from the op shop. It smelled like someone else's house. I stood by the wall all night, watching the other girls in their pretty, new dresses. I felt invisible. The pain in her voice was a live wire. I could only nod, my own tears falling freely now, splashing onto the navy blue suit I'd worn to my father's funeral. But that's not the whole story, Claire continued, turning to address the judge, though her words were still for me. What I never told you, what I've carried with me all these years, is what happened when we got home. I stared at her, my mind racing. I had no memory of what happened when we got home. The entire night was a blur of anxiety and fatigue. I remembered putting her to bed. I remembered her quiet good night, and I remembered going back to the kitchen to face the stack of bills, the weight of our failing world crushing me into my chair. Claire saw the confusion on my face. You came into my room, long after you thought I was asleep. You thought I was cross with you about the dress. And you sat on the edge of my bed. And you started to cry. A fracture appeared in the hardened shell of my memory. A sliver of light. You didn't say anything, Claire whispered, her own voice thick with tears. You just sat there in the dark and you cried. Silent tears. I could feel the bed shaking. I pretended to be asleep because I didn't know what to do. I'd never seen you cry before. And you leaned over, and you kissed my forehead, and you whispered something. The courtroom was so silent I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. I was holding my breath, waiting. I had no recollection of this. None. You whispered, I'm so sorry, my darling girl. I'm so sorry I couldn't give you the moon. Claire's composure finally broke, and a sob racked her body. And then you left. And I lay there in the dark, and I understood for the first time that you weren't just my mom. You were a person. A person who was carrying this immense weight, who was sad and tired and trying so hard to keep everything from falling apart. The blue dress didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that you were hurting. I felt the ground fall away from beneath me. All these years, I had carried the guilt of that yellow dress as a symbol of my failure. I thought it was a moment where I had chosen the farm over her joy. I had built a whole case against myself based on that single, shattering memory of her disappointment. But she had seen something else. She had seen my silent grief. She had seen the cost. That's who my mother was, Claire said, turning now to face the judge fully, her voice gaining a new, powerful strength. She wasn't negligent. She was a fortress. She was the one who stood guard through every drought, every financial crisis, every sick animal, every broken piece of machinery. She was the one who made sure there was always food on the table, even if it wasn't fancy. She was the one who stayed up late, not because she didn't love us, but because her love for us was what drove her to stay up late. She was balancing the books so we could keep our home. She was tending that heifer so we wouldn't lose another source of income. She looked directly at her father's lawyer, her gaze fierce. You talk about emotional distance. What you call distance, I call strength. It was the strength to absorb the blows so I wouldn't have to feel them. Was she worried? Of course she was worried. Our livelihood was dying under a burning sun. But her worry wasn't a lack of love. It was the deepest form of love I have ever known. It was a love that did what was necessary, not what was easy. She turned back to me, her expression softening into an ocean of tenderness and understanding. Dad saw the fun times, the weekends. He got to be the hero because Mum was busy being the foundation. And foundations aren't glamorous. You walk on them. You take them for granted. You only notice them when they crack. But ours never did. Mum, you never cracked. Not where I could see. Only in the dark in my room, over a yellow dress that never, ever mattered as much as you did. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The judge had stopped writing, her pen suspended in midair. Robert had buried his face in his hands. His lawyer looked down at his notes, his confident posture utterly deflated. I could not speak. I could not move. The narrative I had built of my life, the story of the cold, negligent mother, shattered into a million iridescent pieces. In its place was this new, terrifying, beautiful truth. My daughter had not been blind to my struggles. She had been a witness to them. And in that witnessing, she had found a love far more profound and enduring than any yellow dress could ever represent. The case, in that moment, was no longer about divorce or negligence. It was about a mother and a daughter, and a conversation 20 years in the making. And it was only just beginning. After Claire spoke, the atmosphere in the courtroom underwent a fundamental shift. The legalistic chill thawed under the raw heat of her testimony. The judge cleared her throat, a surprisingly human sound in the sterile environment, and asked Claire to continue. Robert's lawyer, looking utterly defeated, offered no further questions. Claire, her composure regained, but her cheeks still wet, looked from the judge back to me. There's more, she said, her voice quieter now, but still clear as a bell. There's always been more. It's just, no one ever asked. And I never knew how to say it. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The yellow dress was one moment, but there were 1,000 others. 1,000 moments where I saw the cost of my mother's love, and I mistook its weight for coldness. She began to speak of her teenage years, the years when the gap between us had felt the widest. She talked about how I'd always been too busy to drive her and her friends to the movies in the city, an hour away. I was so angry about that, she admitted. I thought you were being difficult, that you didn't want me to have a social life. It wasn't until I was older that I did the math. The fuel for a 2-hour round trip, the money for a movie ticket and popcorn, that was a bag of cattle feed. That was a payment on a tractor part. You weren't saying no to me. You were saying yes to our survival. Each word was a key, unlocking a chest of memories I had kept padlocked shut, memories tinged with the bitterness of what I thought was her resentment. She spoke of the nights I spent at the kitchen table, my face illuminated by the pale glow of the laptop screen. I'd come down for a glass of water, and I'd see you there, your forehead creased, your fingers tapping slowly on the calculator. I thought you were just obsessed with money. I didn't understand that you were fighting a war on a dozen different fronts, with bank statements and weather forecasts as your enemies. You were our general, and I was just a grumpy civilian, annoyed that the war was interrupting my television show. Her words painted a portrait of my life that I myself had never been able to see. From my own perspective, I was just a woman failing to be the vibrant, present mother I wanted to be, failing to keep the farm profitable, failing to keep my husband happy. But through Claire's eyes, my failures were being reframed as silent, stoic victories. When Dad left, she continued, her voice dropping, he told me that you were impossible to talk to, that you were married to the farm. He said he felt lonely. And I believed him, at first. Because from the outside, it looked that way. But what I've realized, sitting here today, is that he was lonely because he chose to be a passenger. He worked the land, yes, but he left the fate of our family to you. He never had to stare into the abyss of a zero bank balance. You absorbed that terror alone. He never had to be the one to say no to a new bike or a school trip. You wore that disappointment alone. His loneliness was a choice. Your solitude was a sacrifice. I looked at Robert. His shoulders were slumped, and he was staring at the floor. There was no anger in his posture anymore, only a deep, profound shame. He had constructed a narrative to justify his own departure, a narrative that painted him as the victim of a cold wife. But Claire had dismantled that story, brick by painful brick, and revealed the shaky foundation it was built on. You asked me to describe my relationship with my mother, Claire said, finally addressing the original question. It's a relationship built not on grand gestures or constant, easy affection. It's a relationship built on 1,000 silent sacrifices. It's built on the memory of her crying in the dark. It's built on the sight of her hands, chapped and raw from gardening and cleaning, hands that never stopped working. It's built on the sound of her voice, steady and calm, even when I knew she was terrified inside. She taught me, not through words, but through relentless, unyielding action, what it means to love a family. It means you become the foundation. You bear the weight so the walls can stand tall and the windows can let in the light. She looked at me, her eyes shining with a love so pure and fierce it felt like a physical warmth in the cold room. I am the woman I am today because of that foundation. I am resilient because I saw her resilience. I am responsible because I learned from her sense of duty. I understand the true cost of love because I watched her pay it every single day without ever once asking for a receipt. So, to answer the question of whether my mother was negligent, she paused, letting the silence hang for a beat. The only thing my mother was guilty of was loving us too fiercely, of carrying too much, and of being so strong that we mistook her strength for an absence of feeling. That was the end of it. There was nothing more to say. The judge, after a long moment, spoke. Her voice had lost its stern edge. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. You may step down. The legal proceedings felt hollow and meaningless after that. The details of the divorce were discussed, the division of assets, the fate of the farm, but the heart had gone out of the fight. Robert withdrew his allegation of negligence. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, the ghost of his own complicity. When it was all over, I stood on the courthouse steps, the Queensland sun warm on my skin after the artificial chill inside. I felt dizzy unmoored. The identity I had worn for months, the neglected wife, the accused mother, had been stripped away, leaving me raw and new. I heard footsteps behind me. Mom. I turned. Claire was there, her face puffy from crying, but her eyes were clear. We looked at each other for a long moment, two women separated by a generation, but bound by a shared history that had just been rewritten. I never knew, I whispered, my voice cracking. I never knew you saw all that. I thought I had failed you. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't the hesitant hug of recent years. It was the full, fierce, whole-bodied embrace of a child. I held her tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her, feeling the solid reality of her. "You never failed me," she whispered into my shoulder. "You were just waiting for me to be old enough to understand." We stood like that for a long time, on the steps of the courthouse, as people in suits hurried past us. The past was not erased. The pain of the divorce, the years of struggle, they were still there, real and aching. But they were no longer the whole story. A new story had begun, one built not on silence and misunderstanding, but on a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. We drove back to the farm together, the long, straight road unfurling before us. The red earth, the scraggly gum trees, the vast, empty sky, it was the same landscape I had looked at with despair for so long. But now it looked different. It looked like home. Not because the drought was over, or because the bills were paid, but because the silence between us had been filled. The foundation, it turned out, was not made of concrete and steel, but of love, acknowledged at last. And it was, and always had been, unbreakably strong.